Hello everyone, welcome to JS Gigs and my name is Deepak. Here in this tutorial, we are going to be basically writing a component test. All that while we have learned what Cypress is all about. We have also seen the architecture of Cypress. We have also seen the type of tests that Cypress can write. So in this particular tutorial, I'm going to be writing the component test. So the idea behind component test or the end-to-end test is the way in which they run in the areas of your application that it covers. So when it comes to end-to-end test cases, end-to-end test cases usually covers your multiple component interactions. Say for example, you move from one component to the other and then you pass some data from one component to the other. That's what we say we are going to be testing in end-to-end test cases. However, your component test cases precisely focus on the component alone. So now if I give you quickly a walkthrough of this particular application, you had already seen this application running on the browser earlier. So let me just run this application once again. All right, so I'm going to be starting this application. So let me start this npm run start. So once I start this application, it will boot up at port number 4200. And once it boots up the on port 4200, I'll just give you a walkthrough of it. So here it started. Let me just take you to the browser here and let me start closed 4200. So this is the application we are going to be testing, right? So in this application, the landing component or the component over here is basically app login, right? But right above it, if you notice that it is basically a router outlet, which means that it is being rendered on the login route, which you can also see from here in the URL. And from the route, it renders the app-login, right? So let me also take you back to the VS Code. So here's the VS Code, right? So let me close this, or otherwise what I would do is like I'll basically open the code editor separately, and then once I start writing the test cases or when I start running the test cases, I'll share the entire desktop. So let me just share the code editor for now. So here's the code editor, and let me just close everything down like this. And here, if you notice that it has all these components. So let's just look at the root component of for this particular application, which is app component.ts. So if you open app.component.html here, you would realize that it only renders router-outlet. So router outlet is the outlet which basically renders your entire route. So this particular app component is just a placeholder. But then if you look at the routing file, you would notice that in case if your router or in case of your application is not authorized, it is going to be basically redirecting it to login page all the times, like the way it is done over here. So dashboard component, it takes us to the login in case if the application is not authorized due to this auth card. So what I'm going to do is like I'm just going to be opening this login component now, because login component is a component that I'm going to be testing now. So the login component, the code for this is already being written, and the and the entire tutorial is available on my YouTube channel. You just need to go to the JS Gigs channel and look for this particular tutorial, which is basically listed under the NGRX tutorial. And the GitHub URL is also given in that tutorial. So you just need to click there and then you can actually download this application. Or otherwise, let me just quickly give you a gist of it, right? So here is the browser and let me open my GitHub. So here, the student entry is the application that I've built, and which is basically based on NGRX. So this application you can actually download if you like. So this is the tutorial which I built a few months ago, and it was around NGRX. And also I'll just quickly take you to the JS Gig channel as well. So here is the channel of mine, and then if you go to the playlist, this is the playlist that you need to basically choose. So here in this playlist, you have the entire tutorial available as to how to build that particular application, and you also have the GitHub repository link given over here. Just click on it and it'll take you to the GitHub page, and then you can basically download the entire application like that, right? So now I'm going to be building this I'm basically writing the test cases for this particular application. So let me close this here and close this particular URL as well now and take you back to the code editor. So here in the code editor, as I had already explained you that the application is already available. So what I'm going to do is basically going to be testing this particular component, right? and I had created a test folder inside it. And inside that test folder, I have given a particular cy.ts file. So cy.ts file is also because here in the Cypress configuration, you can notice that the spec pattern is mentioned as cy.ts, and that's why all the testing files which ends with .cy.ts would be picked up for the Cypress configuration, and Cypress would assume that the cy.ts, any file that ends with cy.ts is a testing file according to the Cypress, right? So let me close this down over here, and I'll quickly give you a gist of this particular page, or rather let me take you to the browser and I'll show you the functionality that it has, right? So here on this page, you will notice that this is a landing page, and then once you click on the username for the first time, and here it focuses it on this particular username, but then if you click elsewhere, it turns red. Why it turns red? Because it was a mandatory field as mentioned by the star over here. Similarly is for the password. So if you touch it like this, it goes off. Then let me write it down, the username and also the password. So once I click on everything, that's when the login button becomes enabled. And once the back login button gets enabled, and at the same time, you may also notice that the username and password has also become acceptable field, and that's the reason why it is like this. And also you may notice that here is the JS Gigs logo, and everything else is rendered here on the app login component. So this is the app login component, and we have also just given you a gist of the behavior of this particular form. So what I'm going to do next is basically going to be writing the test cases for this particular behavior. So I'm going to be covering a few test cases. So one of which is basically, let's say if you remove this, what happens? It turns red. It turns red, and then same goes for the password. And the moment it turns red, it also the login button gets disabled. And all of these features, basically writing down what values does it accept and things like that, all of these is something that we are going to be testing in this particular component testing tutorial, right? Now let me take you back to the code editor. So here at the code editor, as I've already created a folder test, under that folder I've created a file which is login.component.cy.ts. So this login.component.cy.ts is the file which will basically hold the test cases for my login component. So let me just write it down first. So first things first, I'm going to do is basically importing this particular component. So what I'm going to do is like, I'm going to be basically doing it like this: login component, and here I'm going to be login component, and then next I'm going to be basically describing. So this is a login component test, right? And here in the login component.test, I'm basically going to be describing the form behavior. So all the IntelliSense that you see over here is basically because of because I have a paid version of GitHub Copilot. So in my personal opinion, please start using it. I'm finding it useful in a lot of areas, but not all. But that's a separate subject altogether. Probably I'll create a different video tutorial around it, like as to how to use GitHub Copilot and all the other code, all the other AI programming tools. But for now, let me just bring my focus back to the login component and its Cypress testing. All right, so let me just save this and also take you back to the login component.ts. So if you look closely over here, this is a standalone component because the standalone property is turned as true over here. So please note that for the standalone or a module based component, there is a different way to test them. So when your component is standalone, there's a different way to basically describe the test for it. And when your component is standalone component, it is easier for you to test. Why do I say so? Because you don't really have to prepare the configuration for your component in case if it is a standalone component, because the standalone component itself, it comes with all its dependencies. As you can see here in the import section, it has all the dependencies that it needs, right? So once you have all these dependencies, you can just directly import this particular component and start using it. Assume when your application or the component is not a standalone component, in which case you will have to basically define the configuration, and that's something which I'll come to a little while later. But then let me just focus on this particular component first. Considering this is a standalone component, so configuration will be a little less, and then we just have to start writing the test cases just as is, right? So let me take you back to the login component.cy.ts. So now I'm going to be basically writing the first test case. So what is that? I'm going to be basically writing for, let's say, if my component mounts well or not, right? So how do I do that? It's really simple. That you need to define the it function. The it function is basically from the Cypress library, and when you use it, it basically has two arguments precisely. The first argument is a string, and the second argument is a callback function, right? So first argument tells us that the name of this particular test case. So let's say Cypress mounts the component, and here in the second argument is basically the component is basically the callback function. So that callback function basically is going to be running when you do this run, right? So what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to be writing cy dot mount, and okay, so cy is as let me just hover my mouse over it. So you may see that cy is a global variable. So global variable in cy context, and cy is also a type of cy event emitter. So cy event emitter, what I essentially means is that cy basically holds, or the Cypress, cy also is an acronym of Cypress. So Cypress, it holds all the functions inside it, functions such as visit, get, and then many other helper function, which are basically used to run or to test your application. So before I describe about the cy function, let me just write down the first test case, and I'll take you to the browser documentation. I'll take you to the documentation of Cypress, and then I'll explain what cy is all about and what are the features, what are the functions that you can use, right? So let me just write down the first of it. So in that case, I'm going to be giving it a name as Cypress mounts the component, and then I'm going to be mounting the component. So what is that component? It's going to be login component, and second is the configuration that we need to define. So since this is being used in the context of, please understand that this particular component uses a lot of material library, and then in order to run this, all I really need to do is also import the browser animation module. So what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to be writing the import ports, and then I'm going to be writing browser animation and also going to be importing this. So here at line number 1, I'm going to be importing this particular module, and there you go, right? So now let me remove this additional variable here. Okay, so now we have basically written the first test case for our login component, and let me run. So before I run the test case, let me again share the entire. So what I'm going to do is, like, you have a command particularly to run the Cypress test case, right? So what is that command? So the command is npx cypress open, right? So once you run the npx cypress open, it opens up the Electron UI. In that Electron UI, it tells us what exactly needs to be done. That's something which we have already seen in the previous tutorial. So I'm going to be running the component testing, and once you click on it, earlier we had seen that it did not really open up any test case because we did not really have any. So now it's going to be opening one. So let me click on it, and once I click on it, it opens another browser window over here. You can see I'm just going to be expanding this. Yep, and there you go. So here you can see that the login component.cy.ts is the component file which is already there, right? And we have also written one test case. So let me just click on it, and it takes a moment, and there you go, right? So it has rendered the first component of ours. So once it renders the component, you may also notice that it is a smaller one. That's something which I'm going to be explaining in a moment from now. But then you can see that the test case passes, right? So it has mounted the login component. Now let's just talk about this particular window, right? So here, if you notice that it is opening in the 500 is to 500 dimension, right? So which is a very small dimension for any component. But in order to change this particular thing over here, which is this small window, we need to go back to the configuration. In order to define the configuration, let me take you here on my code editor and I'll show you this. So here in the code editor, you may notice that we have already discussed this briefly, that cypress.config.ts is a place where we define configuration for our test cases. So as you may notice that by default, it has open 500 into 500 pixel, but then we want it to open such that it takes up the maximum amount of space available. In order to do that, we will really need to define the viewport height. So viewport height, so let me say the viewport height is 800, and then I'm also going to be defining the viewport width, which I'm going to be keeping as 1200. So I save this, and again I'll take you back to my desktop. So here is the desktop. So now you may notice that it has opened up the entire screen properly. Now you can see that the dimension has also changed, which is coming out to be 1200 is to 800 pixels. And you can also see that the component is rendered properly, right? So at least the first test case of our assess. So now okay. So once this portion is done, I'm going to be taking you to the next important bit of Cypress. So what is that? So now let me take you to the browser. And here on the browser, I'm going to be basically taking you here in the component testing, Cypress component testing documentation, right? So here in this documentation, it talks about the similar thing which I've just explained briefly, which is how to import the component and run them. But then it also talks about a very important aspect of these frameworks, right? So if you look at this particular section of our documentation, it tells us that for additional reading, we encourage folks to check out component-driven organization, which talks about the pros of component-driven development and may aid you when trying to figure out if you should be taking a page-based or a component-based approach to build and test your given feature. Documentation, if you click on it, it opens up here. So here it basically tells us that, how do we define a component driven user interfaces. So if you read through this particular this particular documentation, you would realize that this is a design style which everyone else follows, right? So all the modern framework, be it React, Vue, or Angular, or any other modern framework which have followed component driven architecture or component driven interface. So why it is so? So just try to understand, if you're coming from a backend background, you may be very familiar with monolith applications or a component or a microservice based application. So what is monolith? Monolith, you define everything in one go, and you don't really break them into smaller parts and then deploy them separately. You define one particular application, all the APIs in just one go, and then you define them and host them together. However, the microservice architecture is something which tells you, or which tells developer to define their work out the piece of actions in different microservices and bring the all microservices together as one application, right? Or deploy them separately. Similarly, in component-based architecture, we try to ditch the way of monolithic application. So we try to define a UI in smaller different components. And when you define them in a smaller different components, it's easier for developers or testers or anybody involved in making the application to test them easier. And then when you test them easier and they run better, they render better. When they render better, they perform better, and then the user has a better experience while using our application. So all the modern web-based applications precisely are designed using keeping the component-driven user interfaces in mind, or component-driven architecture in mind. So if you have a component-driven architecture, in our case, yes, it is. This is the case. That's why precisely why we have used the component-based testing as of now. We're going to be also doing the end-to-end testing, but that's something which I'm going to be parking for the future tutorial. For now, I'm just going to be talking about the component part, right? So that's all about component. And then why I stopped and wanted you to come to this particular section of the documentation is because I want you to read about it. And so now I'm going to be talking about the other thing. So there is another, as we have seen, we have already written our first test case, right? So what is that test case all about? So we had seen that it made use of a function called it. It also made use of a function called describe, right? So let me open another important thing. So which is here. So if you look at this particular documentation, bundled libraries, right? So you may find some similarities. Let's say if you are a seasoned UI developer, you probably would have heard about all these libraries already. So which is Mocha, Chai jQuery, Synon.js, Synon Chai. So all these functions such as described, context, it, before each, after each, they all come from Mocha. So the Cypress testing utility is built by using all these libraries together. So it brings up Mocha, Chai, and in fact all the most popular libraries and bring the all the good part inside the Cypress. And this is probably one of the another reason why Cypress is gaining a lot of popularity. You don't really have to fiddle with all these libraries. So Cypress basically has a conglomeration of all these libraries. Once it has all the libraries available, you can basically go and make use of these libraries without having to realize that actually under the hood, Cypress uses all these libraries to get things done. So if you are a seasoned developer, as I said earlier, and coming from a UI background, I'm pretty sure you must have heard about these. And so you also have their documentation available here. So Chai.js, Synon, Chai jQuery, Synon.js, and Synon Chai, all these libraries are over here. And then you can basically read about their features and what really they bring onto the table, and that's something which is very interesting precisely. So here you can also look at the assertions are basically coming from Chai JS, and that's something which we are going to be seeing in a short while from now. And this is a Chai jQuery, which is basically to read and also read the DOM element. That's something which you're going to be seeing in a short while from now. That's basically coming from the Chai jQuery library. And here if you look at the Synon.js, so Synon.js is a standalone JavaScript library basically used for stubbing, right? So that's something which we which we are going to be seeing in a short while from now. And if you look at all these libraries, right, they have pretty massive stars, right? So you can see that Synon.js has 9.6 thousand stars, and similarly the Chai jQuery has 371 Chai, and then Mocha also has their GitHub pages are full of stars and great features. So you don't really have to combine them together. They are all available under a hood when you use a Cypress JS, and that's precisely another reason, as I said earlier, that Cypress is getting a lot of momentum in the developer community, right, or in the testers community as well, right? So let me just close down everything. So here are the code editor. If you look at this viewport height and width, also note that in case if you want to open or combine multiple viewport height and width in your test case, you can certainly do so, and that's something you can do in the on before option, and that's something which I will come to a little while later. So let me just cover the other part first and then I'll come to it. So all of these things are optional. All these great tools are available with a combination of all the other libraries that we have seen briefly. So now I'm going to be resuming writing the test cases for this particular component. So we have already seen that our first test case passes properly, so it has no problem at all, such as it we were able to create and mount a particular component. All right, so we have this available already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be writing a next test case in which I'll cover the interaction with my component, which is when I click on it and I move away, that's when it turns red. And that's what we are going to be testing and writing a script using a Cypress to mimic or to basically test this feature. And okay, so now I'm going to be writing the first test of mine. And now I'm going to be writing another test in which I would check if the browser window and all these windows are touched, all these elements are touched or not, and then they become of red color when we touch them and when we move out of the focus. So there are a few of the functions which I'm going to be making use of in this entire selection and unselection mechanism. So let me just write down another test, which I would say, let's say, so as I said earlier, I had also given you a gist of, the library which are basically bundled inside the Cypress in order to select the element or to focus on them or to write the assertion, right? Chai, mocha, chai, and all of that stuff, something we have seen just a moment ago. So now I'm going to be writing another one, so which is cy.get. Okay, so let me just first of all do an inspect. And here in the inspect, if you see, it's the app login, and inside the app login here, I'm going to be not this one, I'm just going to be making a use of this particular form. So if I select this one, and inside the mat card, I come here, and there you go. Inside the form, there are two mat form fields. The first one is okay, so let me first of all tell you the behavior that I'm going to be testing. So let's say if a user clicks on this particular field, so it gets focused, and then the moment I click elsewhere, it gets focused out. And the moment it gets focused out and not filled, it's going to be turning red. So how it turns red is something that let me just open this particular field here. So here on this div class, up there comes a class which is MDC text field invalid. So that's what makes it red color. So let's say if I remove it, you can see that it has turned black again or a normal again, and then the moment I put it back, it becomes red. And the same is the behavior at the password. Let's say if somebody clicks on it and moves elsewhere, that's when it turns red. But then if you try to fill anything, it goes, the classes get then removed, right? Same goes here for the password as well, and this gets enabled. So let's just test this particular field. For this tutorial, I'm just going to be doing the red color test, or the test for a class to come into play, and then I'm going to be doing the positive scenario in the next tutorial. So let me remove it once again, and I think that's something, the behavior we have already seen. So let's say if you click on it, mat form field inside the div, this is the class which we need to make use of, right? So in order to do this, I'm going to be taking you back to the code editor. So here at the code editor, I'm going to be writing this piece of information, this piece of code. So let's say cy.get. So what is that? I'm going to be searching. So basically I'm going to be searching for the input, right? So input, and this input has a form control name. And if this form control name equals to a username, so once it is a username, then I'm going to be bringing it to focus, right? So once it comes into focus, I'm going to be basically selecting another field. So the reason behind selecting another field or bringing other field into focus is to basically focus out from this particular input. So once it focuses out, it comes, the material library puts a red color on its border. So the red color is indicated by a class, the class with the name MDC text field hyphen invalid, right? So so this is the second statement I need to make, and then after this I'm going to be basically making use of another statement. So let me put this statement right here. So in this statement, I'm going to be selecting a material form field, the first of its element, and again the first children should have a class MDC text form invalid, right? So let me save it, and then the other one I'm going to be doing is that once I move away, so this is something that I've done for username, as you can see here, because I'm looking at the first children. So let's say there's another way to do it basically. So currently after line number 11, my focus should have been on the password, and then there's one way of selecting it. There is another way of selecting a particular element is something that I'm going to be showing you now. So cy dot get, and then let's say material form field. So I'm not going to be making use of first children and all of that stuff. So let me remove this. Okay, so let's say if you have multiple such entries coming through the get function, so you can make use of a function called EQ. Once you select EQ, so the element that I'm going to be selecting is number 1, and once you do, that means it's going to be selecting the password which comes second in that hierarchy, right? So second, and then it's children. In its children, the first children should have the class invalid. Let's see if this works, right? So let me close this. Let me run this once again. npx Cypress open. You can see this has come. Let me click on it. Takes a moment, and then click on this as well. Here comes the file which I've recently written. Just click on it, and it opens up, and looks like some error. Recognize expression. Oh yeah. So the problem here is this particular one. So let me change this, and I think we should be good now. So let's just wait, and there you go. So now you can see that both our test cases have passed. So by that, I would want to finish up this episode of testing. I'm going to be picking up another advanced cases in the next one. So thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen, for listening and all that while. If you're liking my work, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also hit the bell icon in case if I post a new video, you would be notified. So thank you once again, and I'm going to be seeing you in the next one.